ledger technology that is perfect for blockchain applications. And when you look at the application use cases inside the enterprise, it's very dependent on the type of application or the type of data environment that you have in place. So taking our technology that supports this capability for managing data over time and applying it to blockchain has been a new evolution for the company and something that we've been focusing on. And I think I'd like to start first by kind of painting the canvas of use cases, and specifically where we recommend most companies start and where we see most companies seeing a very good amount of traction in terms of a meaningful ROI for blockchain applications. And this is in the area of intercompany exchanges, right? So you probably read, about the IBM applications for trade lens and tracing of applications for avocados and things like that. And those are absolutely great use cases. And they certainly bring value to the business in terms of track and trace and sustain. A lot of work that's being done between companies that is really outside of your core systems, it's outside of your point solutions, but it's interactions between your customers and partners that right now do not have an effective mechanism to support the collaborative exchange of information, which means, if you look at the process and people time associated with that, the administration and documentation around, hey, what did we agree to, or what are we trying to agree to? And then kind of a lack of trust in data. And a lot of this is rooted in the fact that no one's really ever solved the issue of, hey, my customer and or my partner is using a different type of an ERP data environment than I am. So how can I pull something together that actually understands how the information has changed over time and gives me the provenance of how the changes have happened such that I can have trust in it. And then all the things that happen after that, right? So you go through all this effort of coming to an agreement, but then you have to do a reconciliation. You have to be able to resolve disputes. There's always a level of audit and remedy that goes along with that to say, oh, well, it's the end of the quarter, so let's figure out what happened. And if boil those all together, this directly impacts a lot of business today in the areas of experience and loyalty, because you only have so many chances to be able to execute your business to go to your end customers correctly, or across to your partners. So if you have a mechanism for doing that, and also to elevate the trust in the exchanges that you're having with both your customers and partners, then you're really able to not only move your business forward, but you're also able to leverage blockchain to provide confidence in these exchanges, and also to eliminate some of the efficiency and cost issues that are associated with these exchanges between companies. And and by the way, I should have said in the beginning, if you have any questions at all during this process, please go ahead and put the question in on the little question banner on the side. We tend to get a lot of questions during these, and this is only a half hour just to kind of keep everybody moving through their day. So if we don't answer them during the course of the webinar, we'll follow up and drop you a note and get you the information. But early on in this past year, somebody commented about the digital transformation and blockchain go hand in hand, and we really agree wholeheartedly about this, because if you think about what blockchain is at its core, is it's a set of chained transactions that represent the agreement between parties about a certain state of information, right? I mean, fundamentally what it is. And it started with the whole Bitcoin, where the two of us, or some number of us, are exchanging Bitcoins back and forth, and it's a very simplistic process to say, I sold Joe 5 Bitcoins at $42, and then you have this digital ledger that's reconciling the 21 million coins, which is the premise behind the distributed ledger and having the reconciliation for all that data. But if you take that into the enterprise, I mean, there are no distrusted parties for the most part. I mean, you're working with people that you interact with every day, and yet there's a tremendous amount of exchanges of information that aren't digitalized yet. And you've heard this discussion before about, where do I start? Well, you can't do anything in blockchain if you haven't, looked at a process and said, is it digitalized? So we talk about investing in digital transformation. And this is something that you're doing today, but you're not necessarily leveraging the fact that the blockchain ledger can provide trust to this transactional information. And you're also perhaps not paying attention to the nuance of setting up a data environment that understands provenance, which is really where you run into trouble with some technologies, is that a blockchain data environment is very different than an ERP data environment, because all of the data elements that are involved in the blockchain application need to be able to understand time, and people need to go back and forth. It's not just selling a coin to another person for a price. It's saying, hey, I want to do this collaboration around work in process for delivery dates for these components. Well, if you have the digital transformation at the data level, then you can go through this notion of alignment. And alignment and realignment is where you're investing in the process transformation. And you have to have that in order to get to final transactions. And this, again, is where we see a lot of problems with work that's being done in blockchain today, is they focus on a final transaction, like this avocado is going to be updated on the ledger by the farmer, and then it's going to be updated by the shipping office when they move the crates across. That's a fairly simplistic application and certainly valuable in terms of its provenance, but it's not necessarily an area where you're spending money today, where you can get an ROI. The area where you can get an ROI is where you have kind of friction in the exchange. You need to go back and forth a number of times and say, well, what is the ship date? What's the new ship date? Oh, why has it changed? And then, ultimately you get into an agreement and say, okay, everybody's now approved this, so therefore I want to commit this transaction to the blockchain, so it becomes irrefutable and you can use it for reconciliation and things like that. But combining these two and the alignment gives you more than just blockchain. It gives you the ability to have machine learning, because if you're chaining these transactions together to support a blockchain application environment, then you should take full advantage of the technology and use it not just to confirm transactions, but also to be looking at the data as it changes over time and leverage that in the context of machine learning. Now I'm going to step just a little bit into why our digital ledger is different, just because it's the webinar from Boardwalktech and we want to make sure you understand the nuance of the digital ledger, because from our perspective, a blockchain application is only as good as the data environment that you stand it up on. And other approaches rely on conventional data technology in the enterprise, which is namely SQL Server databases or a key value, an Excel file or something like that. But none of these data environments understand time. Unless you go in, for example, in a database and you're going to journal the transactions. But then if you do that, the timestamps are kept against the entire record, which means there's a tremendous amount of coding to go in and say, oh, well, not only do I want to be able to take this lead time and understand how it changes over time, but I also want to be able to compare the new value and the old value of the lead time in order to make some decision from either a workflow perspective or a smart contract perspective to say, oh, well, do I want to commit that over to the blockchain, or do I want to have this smart contract execute some process to execute a payment? Well, what we bring, and this is why we pointed out that our company started in 2005, and we've been focused on the issue of what is the right data environment for the enterprise digital ledger as opposed to a Bitcoin digital ledger. And the key is this ability to manage attributes or data effectively at the address of business. So if you look at a grid of information, which is what any enterprise office application has, there's a set of information, and you need to be able to have a system that can say, I want to be able to track when this data value changes over time, and create transaction chains that say, not only did this data value change, but at the same time this person updated the start date. So if they updated the start date, then maybe the salary is wrong because the salary is for this year, as opposed to just the time that this person's been hired. Well, in other blockchain applications and other data environments, if you don't have these transactions chained together, it's very difficult to do a meaningful blockchain application. And you're also not able to take advantage of the things surrounding machine learning and other applications. which is why, when Forbes took a look at what we did, they talked about this digital ledger being a tech at the heart of the enterprise blockchain. So we just urge you, when you look at blockchain applications and ROI, look at it beyond a single proof of concept, because the value of blockchain over time is, we think, a great representation of where EDI can go, and specifically collaborative EDI, which, if you go back to this use case of where should I focus first in order to get a strong ROI, and we say, well, it's the multi-party exchanges between companies, then a lot of that work today, at least in terms of the transactional agreements, is done using EDI, but that is a very difficult process to get to. It's certainly not collaborative, and it doesn't handle exceptions and disputes where you get a lot of the friction. So by using a digital ledger to support an application environment where you're taking data from existing transactional systems, you're saying, hey, I want to be able to set up this shared ledger between multiple parties, have the capabilities for access control, but then have the people interact inside of their virtual nodes, whether it be Excel or a browser or part of an application. And as the data is changing through time, committing it to the blockchain ledger, which we provide from Boardwalktech, or a blockchain ledger from Hyperledger or any other application environment. The key is that this data is moving over time and exchanging the attributes as it changes, and then as this information matures, you're able to see, well, what did it change? Who changed it? Does this affect the collaborative exchange, or is this something that's now elevated to the point where, I'm going to commit this to the digital ledger? And you need to have a ledger that gives you the flexibility to touch a lot of information. So this kind of goes back to the example where we were talking about, the avocado. Generally, there's only one person going in and touching data at a time. And again, this is an important part from a ledger perspective. You need to have an environment where data can be coming in from your transactional systems, data can be coming in from your customer or your partner systems. Then you need to be able to put information in here that says, oh, I just saw this latest input, come in from Oracle saying there's been an update to the ship date. What do I think about that? And these are attributes of information that need to be able to all move independently in the context of a digital ledger in order to support the application that has the exchange of data, and then also makes it so that you're able to measure the ROI, because really that's kind of the key for it. And in fact, this capability of being able to pull information in and work on all transactions, not just final transactions, and support this collaborative exchange is something that actually Gary gave us a cool. What you see is this notion of transaction chain. So I see data changing over time, and I'm able to understand who changed what, and then also without having to do any custom work, you're able to go in and say, help me understand exactly how this data value changed and who changed it, and then based on this, do something. Act in the context of the ledger, or notify somebody that another change has been done, or from a workflow perspective, surface this information up so that people can make some changes. And then, these are the areas where you start to get even more tangible ROI from a blockchain environment, is if you look at the data and say, this is much more than just storing data away in a ledger that says, here's the agreed to data values that we agreed to as part of this transaction chain. But also, if you're doing this transaction chaining, you're able to look at the information and say, for example, I certainly want to be able to do a PO reconciliation process across the companies that I work with, but I also want to be able to look at the data exchanges and more than just go in and do a verify and audit and have irrefutability, but I'd like to be able to understand how has this data changed over time, and can I learn something from this in the context of, oh, for this particular SKU and this purchase order and vendor, there's a risk of this actually being late because of the number of times somebody's made a change to the ledger that represents this change, the churn, if you will, in the work in process. And if you start putting these pieces together, then you're going to see a much more stronger ROI on your blockchain investment, because again, back to this thing, it's the blockchain application is not just a singular entity. It's an investment in the ledgers in order to stand up the data. It's an investment in the collaboration to support better visibility, so you remove friction and uncertainty in the data. And then it's leveraging the fact that you have this time-based data inside your enterprise to be able to take advantage of that and understand, what does this information mean beyond collaboration? Because this is where you really start to take some value in the enterprise in terms of implementation. And we also suggest, from an ROI perspective, that you focus on things that can be stood up and prove value rapidly. And we talk with lots of very large companies. As you saw in the beginning, we have 25 of the Fortune Global 500 as customers, and most people do not have patience for, oh, well, let's work on this for 6 months and then maybe we'll be able to see something. You need to be able to see value in a 4 to 6 week process, and we bring a capability such that we can stand up a blockchain application without really having to pre-build everything before you can get value out of it. And again, this is just a thing to be aware of as you talk to vendors in this space, to say, hey, it's great you showed me this demo that shows me inventory ROI or inventory blockchain, but that's not the way I do inventory. And you'll find that they have to do a lot of customization and changes in order to try and match what you do, whereas we've been doing this for 10 years and focusing on really any application in the enterprise, which kind of brings us to the use cases. And I talked earlier about multi-party use cases where this is information that's being exchanged between your company and another company that you're doing business with. And if you kind of take this across all the different industries, we always generally like to say that when you look at every industry, there's always issues around payments or terms or compliance or contract rules or logistics in terms of goods or services, whether it be hard goods or project work or anything else. There is always they send you a purchase order to say, I want to execute on this business, and then you execute on that business, and then depending on how that turns out, then there's an invoice and there's some exchange that goes back and forth in order to pay that and recognize that it's been finished. Well, a blockchain gives you the agreed to state of that data to be able to say, okay, now we've agreed to this, which is addressing the issue of where we are from a process perspective, but it also gives you the ability to say, okay, we reached a milestone that we've agreed to, and therefore we can execute payment, which is the promise of the smart contract, to say the data has now reached the point where we can execute a specific payment or something else that otherwise you're going through and you're having to audit and reconcile the records, but now this can be brought on chain. And then if you kind of go down across different areas, we do a lot of work in insurance, around policy management, in contract and claims efficiency, because there's a lot of folks that are touching that type of information. Same in food and beverage. We're certainly doing work in food safety, in counterfeiting and provenance, but also there's a tremendous amount of friction in the area of trade promotion settlement. And again, this is exchanges back and forth between the companies to say, what are we going to run for promotions this month? And then, hey, how do I get all this to line up so I can understand exactly what the changes are? And the same things in like apparel, for example, very important for transparency and traceability. And there's a lot of intermediaries. And we're not suggesting that the ROI use case should be focused necessarily on disintermediating people in your existing multi-party exchanges, because there's a role that they play in the business. But if you have a more efficient exchange between all the parties and something takes a lot less time, then everybody's winning. So then let's focus specifically on the use case examples that are addressing or in this area of the exchanges between your business partner value chain. And I think, it's important to point out that, as you see in this survey from Deloitte, that, almost 75% of the companies say they see a compelling use case, and that, a third of them are doing blockchain deployments already in process. Well, a lot of the compelling business cases, and this is also echoed by Gartner, is in this area of efficiency and cost, because it can be meaningful for your business. You can see an ROI, you make everything run better, and you understand digital ledger technology, how it fits in the enterprise, and what a blockchain ledger means. And it's certainly much better to do that in the context of interactions with your existing business partners than it is to go start, a new business venture and say, hey, I want to tokenize some part of my value chain and introduce this as a new concept to market. You can get there, but we suggest, walking before running. And these use cases are ones that we consistently have conversations and do work with customers. So I've already mentioned the purchase order and invoice reconciliation, just because almost without exception, if you're interacting with people either on the front end or the back end of your business, there's some exchange that's going back and forth between both of you, and you need to be able to, not only reconcile that, but also understand how's it going. And that's really where, the work and process visibility around lean times or key milestones or payments, or if it's a multi-step process, has everything been completed, and where do we stand in the process? And then the supplier and vendor onboarding. I mean, just think about the process that you go through there. And I'm not even talking about like physician credentialing, because there are some blockchain use cases that are being done now where at a state level or a multi-state level, different insurance companies have come together in order to, take physician credentials and put them, onto a blockchain so they can be leveraged across multiple parties. This is just supplier and vendor onboarding in terms of working through that whole process and getting to the state where you both agree that, here's the current, credit history or, contract compliance for this particular person that you're working with. And then depending on the industry, I mean, there's also things around contracts and policies and compliance, setting them up, defining the rules, and then also, running through the renewal process. This is, again, something that has a tremendous amount of churn in most industries. So having a blockchain environment that, supports this, captures the agreed to milestones, and yet also gives you visibility into, how things are changing. Those can be, very powerful in terms of returning an investment to you as a business. And then, get the idea, anything where there's a lot of touch points between parties, because, honestly, that's what costs companies business today, is the friction in the exchanges between parties. And then if you drop down and you say, well, what's the measurable ROI? Probably the biggest one is this notion of process cycles. I mean, you would be astonished, and the next slide will show this briefly, what it costs for companies that are, spending time doing things manually. But if you can drop a process from 4 to 6 weeks to, basically on demand, I mean, that's returning everybody's time to the business. It's giving you the opportunity to do things 4 times instead of once during the same time frame. And then just giving you better visibility into what's going on. And if you do that, then you can look across your entire business and say, well, if I have better visibility, then can I be more confident in what I'm making my decisions on? And if it's a manufacturing company, I mean, you can reduce inventories, 2 to 4%, because you don't have to carry as much, safety stock. Or if you're leveraging this transaction chaining capability in addition to blockchain, then you're able to do some prediction, around drops in revenue or issues with inventory, or whether I'm going to stockouts or fulfillment issues. And then on the financial side, I mean, the dispute of resolutions and also the working days lost each month for reconciling differences. I mean, a lot of companies just think that is a working part of the business that you can't get rid of, but blockchain really can return these days to your business and just make the relationship so much better, which means, on both sides, I mean, imagine taking your DSO, from 60 days down to 40 days. I mean, what would that mean to your business to have that, capital returned back in. And so we took one example of a $300 million company that had 40 people manually exchanging information back and forth about an understanding for, specifically, this is the work in process exchange. And the manual exchanges back and forth was taking 10% of everyone's time, which was, you can read the numbers, $300,000. We talked about the productivity savings, but you can take this calculator, and we'd be glad to give it to you, and plug in the average cost of your employees and maybe the cost of, your inventory and what you're spending in your IT budget, and you would see, a pretty astonishing annual savings for just taking one application that you're doing manually today and moving it through this process of, I want to digitalize it, I want to enable the alignment with the blockchain trust, and I want to be able to, add in the capabilities for machine learning so I can get an understanding of, how the data has changed over time and start to predict what's happening in my business, as opposed to respond to what's happening in my business. So as you come up at the, the bottom of the half hour here, we always like to challenge people with, an offer. And this has been very interesting for companies because many companies are saying, hey, I don't know exactly where to start, but I'd like to be able to do something in blockchain. Well, we do a lot of work with clients, both directly and through our partners, to do, enterprise use case evaluations. So it's a fairly straightforward process to say, obviously we walk through these use cases here and we can provide this deck to you, plus the video will be available so you'll be able to see that, but also to say, hey, well, here's the nuance of what the application is that we're doing, and does this make sense from a blockchain perspective and will it fit? We can do that, and we can also do the digital ledger custom demo. So you'll be able to see, an example of something that you're actually working with today, obviously within reason in terms of scope, but that'll give you the ability to say, well, here's a use case, here's some information, and then, here's an opportunity to go back and have a very specific, proof of value to show a projection of where you think the ROI is going to come, rather than doing, a very expensive long-term custom software application deployment, which if you just go with downloading the open source and doing that work yourself or using just an open source platform, there's a tremendous amount of coding that has to go in to do it. And then to top things off, we're offering a no per user cost up to 1,000 users for the first deployment, which has been very interesting because other applications, charge you by the node or have some cost for the users that are part of it. And we think in the multi-party exchanges, the main economic benefit, or the person that runs private permission value on this, trying to make sure it's easier for people to deploy. So please email us at info@boardwalktech.com. It's 11:30. Hopefully this information was useful to you. We'd be delighted to talk with anybody. You can email us at info@boardwalktech.com or simply reply to the invite. And also we'll be reaching out to people to try and follow up and see how we can take a use case that you have and show you how you can get a compelling ROI. Thank you for joining our webinar today, and everybody have a really happy and restful holiday. Thank you so much.